clear. But I was interested in, you know, what does this mean to arrive at age 49, thinking you have one history, thinking that your most intimate, sort of physical, biological, hereditary kind of connection is one kind of connection, and learning at 49, oh, by the way, so it turns out, of course, that her mother had an affair with a Turkish man while they were in Germany. The Turkish man, her biological father, was, and it's been a few months I've been in touch with her, but as far as I know, is still alive. She has since met her Turkish father and her several half-sisters and so on. So what is it like to be new in this way, to essentially be made a different person? So that was the impulse behind that book. I was just fascinated with that notion that, you know, any one of us, in principle, any one of us could discover tomorrow, you know, somebody gives you the phone call, hey, could we talk? Oh, there's something I didn't mention.
Or that the experiences, you know, that the notion of the self as a constantly unstable thing.
Right.
You know,
Yeah, I was thinking.
there are a couple of people here who might have their sense of self that was affected by civil war, for example, and they cannot, and their unstable sense of self is affected by that as the years go by, and there are stories about that. But I think that you'll come to find out later, or you'll never find out. You'll just always feel them in the air. But what I found also interesting about those two books juxtaposed together is that they're also not only a representation of the human condition, but also of the American condition, that you'd have such opposite polar ends of
Right.
what it is to document an American persona in a moment in time.
Right.
A plurality in a sense.
Right. And in many ways, I think, you know, they're both of them troubling and problematic projects in the sense that there's some version of presumption involved in even trying to write either of them. You know, each one tries to engage someone else's voice essentially by trying to enter into it. And so I think there are a lot of, for both of them, you know, there are questions to be asked, and you're right, in time, well, the decision may be against both books, but
you've just created a segue here into translation.
yeah.
So essentially, all reading is an act of translation, all writing is an act of translation, all co-optation of voice is an act of translation, and not only are you a translator, but particularly in these two books perhaps, and many more, Lines of Inquiry, where you continue with collage work, and then First Fire, then Birds, as your own work, selected work, you end up rewriting your own work. As opposed to the traditional way of saying, I only want two poems from the first book, 10 from the second, you know, two-thirds of the third, or whatever, and then whatever you did with that, you ended up writing it as a new book in a way.
Right.
And so, you know, this notion of voice, translation, co-optation, in the art, which for me, and we talked about this recently, leads to this very problematic, and I think that we're deluded in the public space in talking about it, to these problematic notions of originality, and authenticity, which I think are both false notions, that in order to propel a market economy, as you said, a criterion for excellence or for success, we push so much on each other and the audience, those who love poetry and are incapable of writing a word. The notion of this is an original voice and this is an authentic thought. This is an original American voice or an authentic American, or this is an original immigrant voice or immigrant voice, and this is an authentic exilic something or the other, and so forth. And you know, I was just wondering if you can talk about that, because I think the reproduction of so much hackneyed stuff, not to disregard it, as you say, you want to remain connected to a human past, not to pretend that we're in some sort of constant evolution. But you know,
makes it intimate.
It's the glare of it.
Oh, there you go.
You know, how do you see that in your own work? Since you're basically your own iconoclast. You know, maybe if I can bring it up from this angle.
Yeah, no, it seems to me connected to what you were just speaking of just a moment ago about the construction of identity, that we're surely all of us engaged in some form of identity construction, that we, at least it seems to me to be, if not self-evident, at least a good case could be made for its being a valuable.
Would the door bring any more circulation in the air? If you open more, make it work.
The front row is designated as the official fans.
No, we're good. Yeah.
Yeah.
You got a lot of fans.
Girls.
But yeah, so I think we're constructing identity, and so remaining alive and remaining engaged with language in such a way that, yes, we're manipulating and changing language as poets, but I hope also being manipulated and changed by it. And so I hope that my relationship to other people's poetry and my relationship to my own poetry, I hope will continue to change over time. And I also would want to, you know, we often talk in class, we often talk, and you know from conversation before we began, that there are at least a few teachers in the room with various, you know, different college, high school, so on. And one of the things that we do very early on in talking about poems and talking about literature in general is to distinguish between the speaker and the writer in a poem. And so we're very careful to talk about the speaker in Keats's ode and not assume that it's Keats himself any more than we assume Hamlet's Shakespeare. But that word speaker assumes that the fundamental activity of the poet or of the voice is the putting out. And I want to suggest that a poet might also be a listener, that the act might have more to do with listening than with the speaking. That in other words, the origin of the poem might not be in the poet's head. You know, it all started in the poet's head. I woke up and, you know, I'm Coleridge after my laudanum-induced sleep, and I wake up with Kubla Khan. That was, you know, it was in my head. That's where it started. Maybe it starts in other voices, and maybe it starts in language that we're hearing elsewhere, and maybe it starts in people who are other than ourselves, and so on. And we receive it first before it comes out then as the voice.
I'd like to, you know, see if maybe bring other people in, and so maybe we're not. After a while, I may just start talking to Harvey like we're on a train ride, and so I you know, I want to see. And if anybody wants to comment or have any questions, you know, from your own experience as writers and readers of poetry about maybe some of the points that we've discussed.
Just people.
I'm interested in what you just said about listening to the poem. Can you just elaborate a little more? I mean, do you feel that your poetry is coming from an outside source and you have to be open to it? And listen and transcribe correctly, or I just want to hear more about that.
Right. Yes, I do have that sense. There's a kind of famous passage in the British poet William Wordsworth wrote a preface to one of his collections of lyrical ballads that often gets quoted, or at least when I was in college, it was considered a kind of canonical, a very important canonical text. It may or may not be taught that way nowadays. But he talked about poetry as emotion recollected in tranquility. And that's a very widely sort of adopted notion. So we think of, poets are people who feel things very intensely, have deep emotions, and who like to withdraw into quiet places with their beanies and pipes and however they do their thing, but to recall these feelings of emotion and peaceful, and to record those feelings, which is fine. I got nothing against that, but it doesn't seem to me to exhaust the possibilities for poetry, and my own poetry, though it connects very closely with my own feelings and experiences and so on, it doesn't originate there. It starts in things I've read or overheard, or people I've met and been friends with, or whatever. It starts somewhere else outside of me, and it starts as an act of either literal or metaphorical listening. So it can be a very literal listening. So Anis very, very sweetly talked about a set of love poems in one of the books, and one of the titles of one of those love poems is a direct quotation from an overheard cell phone conversation, and so it's just pulled as the kind of starting point, which then becomes connected to something else. So I feel more like a witness, a compositor, a collator, a curator of a curator of language. That what I hear. The philosopher Levinas talks about our being the face as a kind of, we are put into, like it or not, we're put into an ethical relationship simply by face to face, by the fact that you have a human face and I have a human face, and we incur obligation from that fact. And it seems to me that I incur obligation by the fact of living in a world of language, living in a world in which the medium of our communication with one another in language, to me it feels as though an obligation is imposed on me by that fact. And so I understand my poetry, rightly or wrongly, I understand my poetry as an attempt to live up to that obligation, to fulfill that obligation.
What in this context of connecting feeling with poetry, and I believe Fady will help me with that. In Arabic, the word for poetry is the same word for to feel and to sense something, which is the poet is essentially the one who receives voices, he receives ideas, and then regenerate them again. I think Fady can help me with that.
One who sense, yeah. Is one who, yeah. A sensor is a feeler or a sensor, yeah.
Right. And journaling is great for that, because I record so many things that I hear and see. I'm a high school teacher, and I have a journal constantly. Things down. I don't always turn them into poems, though. And I have a lot, even listening to NPR, you can get.
Sure.
Just interesting side stories to start you out, and I will hear things, and I will record the things that I hear, and leave them in the journal, and then later other things happen, and